Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here with you, and it's particularly heartening to see so many school students in this room. As a matter of fact, covering the assassination, it changed my life. It changed all of our lives somehow, and it changed my life. It changed me from a broadcast news person to an English professor. And that's what I finally finished my, well, not quite finished my political career. No, it's George who has the political career. My professional career. And I had finally decided that since we had spent our time reporting tragedy, that there were better things to do for this world, and one of the best, if not the best, is to teach people like you who have come to this place so you can find something out about the history of your country. This was one of the saddest chapters in our American history, as you well know. It's been 45 years now, and although we were young fellows back then, and I guess you could say in our prime as a sort, we're still pretty healthy for geezers. And in particular, Bill Mercer, who, let's see, George and I and Bill have all three had overhauls of the heart and things like that you couldn't have back then. And even though Bill has done that, I have a hard time running to keep up with him. It's difficult to say just how covering the assassination on that terrible day affected all of us. It affected us in ways that none of us has ever, I think, been able quite to explain. But it was a day that began like any other when a president was going to come to town. Except for the fact that we news people for KRLD were in particular concerned because Dallas had already had two embarrassing incidents that were not too long before the assassination of the president. One of them had taken place here in Dallas during the presidential campaign when President Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, the Texas senator, were running for office, and Lyndon Johnson and his wife were jostled and heckled as they walked across the street from one of the two downtown hotels to the other. It made national news because LBJ was a giant fellow who was politically astute, and he knew that television film was being shot, and so he moved as slowly as he could, and it was all captured on film as he sheltered his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, from the attacks of people who were their political enemies here in Dallas. Dallas was not, as a whole, a city that had voted for President Kennedy. And President Kennedy had many political opponents in this town, people who did not trust him at this stage. And so we were more worried about appearances than certainly the terrible thing that took place. Our United Nations ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, had been heckled and spat upon and struck with a placard when he came and honored Dallas on United Nations Day with his speech. He was our UN ambassador. And it was a terribly embarrassing thing for the city. So only 1 month later, in this city, the president was assassinated. And so for years, Dallas, among many people in these United States, was called the city that killed the president. And Dallas didn't do that. One lone nut did. And we've studied this for a long time. And in our book, When the News Went Live, we try to make clear how things happened and in what order. Back in those days, our television facilities were primarily used not for news. In fact, they were never used for news. They were used instead for our broadcasts of the Dallas Cowboy games and of political speeches. And up until the November 22nd tragedy, that's what TV news had been all about. It was a more formal sort of thing where cameras and directors all showed up and did a very well-organized program. But on that day, everything went crazy. And so for the first day in American history, television began to broadcast news from moment to moment. Nowadays, you have cable news, or at least what they call news these days. And not much of it is. If any blonde woman goes missing, why, it will be on every cable news channel for week after week. And it will be there to the exclusion of more important news to tell you about what's really happening in your country and across the world. All four of us would, if we could, change today's broadcasting to a more civilized discourse. News in our day was the sort of thing that we did not have to sell. We did not shout the news. In fact, when the assassination took place, we tried to keep as calm as possible while we were on the air, because we knew that the world was going slightly mad. The President of the United States, the leader of the free world, had just been shot to death just outside this building. And this was a horror that spread over the world. We were in the very middle of it, and we knew the dangers. There were bomb threats to all of the major media outlets in Dallas. And we knew that there were a lot of crazies out there. And two of them actually surfaced, one who killed the president and one of our Dallas police officers, and the other who killed the man who had killed the president. Wes Wise and I were on the motorcade. I was down at Main and Ackerd, still talking when the president was being shot about 1,000 feet away, or 1,000 yards away from me. Then suddenly I found myself speeding to Parkland Hospital, and there the president, the governor, both wounded, were inside, and for some time we did not know how badly they'd wounded, how badly they had been wounded, and whether our president would live. Then finally the sad news came. We waited outside of Parkland Hospital. I had gotten our mobile unit back, our radio mobile unit back to nearby the emergency room entrance. And so it was from there that I broadcast with our 10 o'clock news anchor, and we broadcast the saddest scene that I have ever seen in my life. You can understand, I think, how this changed our lives. And then 2 days later, I was in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters when they were about to transfer Oswald from the city jail to the county jail, which is just, or was just across the street, just across the plaza, when suddenly Oswald was shot on live television. And NBC broadcast that shot live, and we at CBS came there a split second later. I was holding on to a microphone, pointing a microphone at police officers who were pointing pistols at me. And it was one heck of a fight down there. So we all tried to keep our heads as we broadcast, not only on the day of the president's death, but on every day in succession after that. I have never lost my sense of deadly seriousness about the news. It's why I hate to see too many car chases, too much news that's just shot from helicopters, and there's no information, but isn't that an interesting picture? That's what you see too often on cable television. It's a kind of an abdication of our journalistic responsibility to a certain extent. And we fellas were there on the first day when the news went live. We had to move our television mobile units from the Trade Mart. We had intended to broadcast the president's speech there. We had to move units to the Dallas Police Headquarters. Channel 5, which was NBC, they moved their mobile unit, and when I call it a mobile unit, these were funny-looking trucks. We called ours the bread truck. We had another one we called the Blue Goose, and they had to be large because the first videotape machine that our television station had installed was so large that they had to cut a hole in the roof of the building and lower it down into our studios with a crane. And even the mobile videotape recorders were as big as a great big chest type deep freeze, and they had videotapes that were 2 inches wide and reel to reel. That's what our technology was in those days. To get a signal from where we were broadcasting the news to any other place, it was necessary then to have either a telephone line or a direct line of sight microwave beam. And there were no communication satellites to give you GPS locations as you see today. There were no satellites up there to bounce our communication signals, our microwaves off of, and move our signal anywhere else on the face of the earth. So as we broadcast from Dallas Police Headquarters, our microwave was bouncing the signal off of our tower, which was then sending it through our studios, which was then bouncing it back up our tower and sending it out across the country to be relayed across America by tower after tower after tower, all the way to New York, where our studios, our CBS studios, were switching and putting us on the air and off the air on television. So it was quite a day for broadcasting, and we were in the middle of it. We didn't have time to shed tears during that first day, although it was sometimes difficult to talk, knowing what we were in the middle of. And I do not exaggerate when I tell you that it was like a continuing nightmare. I had to keep asking myself, is this really happening? And yet I had to keep reporting it at the same time. And it was difficult to do. All of us were the same way. We finally had to shed our tears in private, and Bill said just a minute ago as the four of us were talking, somehow about this time every year, the memories become more vivid again, and they come back again. So that's why we're here, to try to answer some of your questions and try to tell you what happened on that day, long before you were born. Later we will take questions, and there are 2 microphones up here. You're going to need to come up and stand in a nice quiet line when you ask those questions and speak into these microphones. we're going to assume that this one's going to work this time. And you speak into the microphones so that your questions can be recorded as well as our answers. My name, as Stephen told you, is Bob Huffaker. This is Bill Mercer. This is George Phoenix. And that's Wes Wise on the end. Bill was indeed, as they said, a famous wrestling announcer. It was primarily because of his size, and the wrestlers liked to pass him around. Not really. In fact, he was at one time the fourth most famous broadcaster in Israel. That's how far his programming went, with giant wrestlers wearing capes and that sort of thing. But he is to this day still doing play-by-play, and a couple of years ago won an award again for his play-by-play work. And his students keep saying, look, will you let some of us kids get a chance after all these years? Because Bill is still in the business, still doing play-by-play. George is a blogger now, and if you want to go to Blog of Ages on your URL, you can read what George writes from day to day, and it's worth it. And Wes Wise, who was the Dallas mayor, who was the first Dallas mayor who was actually an independent, the first Dallas mayor in decades who had been independent, was one of the main reasons that Dallas finally regained its reputation as a real city, and not one that supposedly killed the president. Dallas didn't have any more nuts per square mile than the rest of the metropolitan areas in this country, but we certainly did have our share, and they were loud. And so they had given this city a bad reputation, and Wes Wise, serving as mayor for 5 years, certainly did change that, because he was a real fellow. Also, a pioneer sports broadcaster whose career goes so far back that he used to actually recreate ball games off of ticker tape. Bill can do that too. I've seen him. And if you go to the ballpark at Arlington, you'll see a studio replica of the one that Wes used to use, along with Gordon McClendon, broadcasting games off of ticker tape, which would just say, fly out left field. And he would manufacture the drama to go with it. And there's a deep pop fly, deep into right center field, that sort of thing.
You're pretty good.
They were better. Bill and Wes were far better. I can't do sports. So I'll hush now. We'll take your questions later, and we'll move on alphabetically to Bill Mercer.
Thank you, Bob. I wasn't the fourth most popular TV personality until much later in my career, but that did happen thanks to the Von Erich boys, and that's another story we won't go into. I read a little note in the paper today when Bob mentioned the news today, and somebody wrote, I would really like to see more conservative talk on National Public Radio. We did not have liberal or conservative talk in 1960s. National Public Radio is the best radio news in America right now. You can't count on local stations anymore. To say that they should have a conservative and or a liberal bend is what's wrong with our education of what is news today. We broadcast the news. God help us, Eddie Barker would have flailed us if we ever had put our bias into a news story. We had a program called Comment. It was one of the first talk shows, interview people, and then people call in and ask questions of the person interviewed. We had left, middle, and right. And we went way out on either side. But we did not yell at them. We did not embarrass them. We did not insult those guests as you hear today on so-called talk radio. I hope we put the fairness doctrine back into the broadcasting industry so that people who are berated, insulted, demeaned, degraded by some of these people will have equal time to answer those charges. That will take care of some of the problems today. So said my editorial comment. Let's move on to 1963. I was a sportscaster doing the Dallas baseball team at the time, minor league team. And on the off season, I evolved into the news department again and took part in the news operations, which I had done before. I was a journalism major along with radio in college, so all of us have journalistic experience. I was at that day, while all these guys were out working, I was doing my job of broadcasting the new news. After that said, I came across the street to the news department. It was in chaos. I had not been notified while I was on the air that the president had been shot. It just didn't seem to register that probably somebody should have told me. It was 12 o'clock to 12:15 then. After that, it was a chaotic afternoon of phone calls from all over the world. We were answering the phones. We had an open line to Massachusetts, to Boston, to give them the latest news all the time. And as the day wore on then, these guys came in with their recordings, with their film. We did not have videotape machines in those days to carry. We just had little portable recorders and film. You had a film camera. I had a little film camera with one lens. I was supposed to be tight shot, wide shot, medium shot. And that means you got to move around a lot with a little camera, 16 millimeter. So when they all came back to prepare the news that night, which was just enormous, one guy was left, me, who had not been out there slogging around, and they sent me, Eddie Barker sent me to the third floor of the police station. And the engineers, Howard Chamberlain, I remember, in fact, put this huge camera, you see it on the front of our cover, huge studio camera, up into the hallway at the police department. And that was going live, as Bob said, by microwave back to the station. Now, if you've seen these shows today, they have a director, they have a floor man, they have somebody counting you down, they have somebody giving you instructions. Not then. I was there with a microphone and the camera. And that meant you got to come up with something, and you got to know where you're going, and where you're going is to anybody that moves that you know. One of the fortunate things about us and Channel 4, as having the best news department in town at that time, we also had the best, I think, relations, I'm sure the other news people did too, with the police department, the FBI, the county people. We knew everybody. Jerry Hill, who helped capture Oswald, did traffic for us, and he was on the police department. So all those guys, Arch McDonald, all the rest of them, were coming in that evening. And my job then was to move around, try to get interviews, and early on, I'll give you one funny story. We had a lot of people from outside who came in here, and the obnoxious reporters that we had never encountered before, particularly from an area called Yankee Land for us in those days. The Yankees came in. We were still kind of southerner in turn. It got to be a little hectic and violent almost up on the third floor. But early on, when I had the camera down there and Howard ran the microphone cable down so I could move around, we had to stay connected. This guy came in, a great big guy with cameras all over him, and he said, "What's this cable?" I said, "That's my microphone cable." And I had a microphone about this long, and he said, "Well, if it gets in my way, I'll just yank it out." And I said, "You do, and this microphone will be crushed right on your head." And Howard came down to see if I was going to be fighting. I'm not tall enough to make accusations like that. But it was that kind of thing. Don't bother our equipment. Don't upset us. You've got your space, I've got my space. It worked out okay. As the evening went on, I interviewed. I was pushed around by the mob. One time I yelled, "I'm being pummeled. I'm being pummeled." These people were they'd lost their senses. Oswald came through. He said, I'm a patsy. Mrs. Oswald, his mother, who was a bit of a flake, and his wife, Marina, who we all know from later on, came in. So it was that kind of night. Everything was going on just up and down, and we had nobody to tell us what to do. Then they had the brilliant idea, we have always defended the Dallas police. They bent over backwards to help the media and to try to be fair and honest with everybody. And they didn't, Oswald had a black eye, but he got that because he tried to shoot Arch McDonald. Nobody mistreated anybody. So then they had the brilliant idea of having the Oswald press conference in the basement. And we were all these guys who were seething with anger to try to write the Pulitzer Prize story of the year, all went down into the basement. Our engineers, bless them, got that camera down into the basement. It's on the front of our book, that same big camera. Gene Paschelik was behind the camera. And here comes Oswald in, and mayhem occurred. Everybody started yelling questions. So I went down and knelt down so I could pick up anything that Oswald said. The guy who was next to me, I guess was a print reporter. So we're there, and it lasted about a minute and a half, very short time. They realized it was totally out of control. They didn't know that people would act that bad. So as they were starting to move out, this reporter next to me said, Oswald, have you been charged with anything? And he said, no, I haven't been charged with anything. Well, I knew, because I'd been told, I said, yes, you have. You've been charged with the death of the president. When we wrote this book, I thought maybe I dreamed that, and it took a lot of research to go back and find on the tape my voice saying that to Oswald. Obama and Ayers had an association briefly at one time, and we've all been through this thing of the election. And I would laugh to people. I said, well, I talked to Oswald once. I'm probably a terrorist. I'm probably one of those guys. But that was my association and my conversation with Oswald. After that day, I had some other assignments, coming over here to the triple underpass and walking around with a camera, with a sound camera, and reading the inscriptions of flowers left at there. Also was sent over to with a CBS engineer, and the director said, see if you can talk to some conservative. That was an interesting thing. It takes a lot of time, but what the engineer and I said, how do we find one of those? They don't wear a sign that says I'm a conservative. We did happen to luck out, and a man came down the street and said, and I walked over to him very calmly, and I said, sir, I'd introduce myself. I said, obviously you're a businessman who's taken some time off to come down here today. I'd just like for you to, if I could ask you, what is your feeling here today? And he said, I hated President Kennedy, but I didn't want him dead. And I came down here today to apologize to him for this. We're lucky sometimes when you have news. We're also sometimes very good. That's basically what I did. I wrote a chapter, and the man who rode with a lieutenant colonel pell-mell to the hospital was not thrown out when he was found out to be a cameraman for a news outlet. George Phoenix, he's got all in the world to tell you about handling cameras and being hit by various people.
November the 22nd, 1963 was a day a lot like today. Beautiful November, crisp. The decision was made for Kennedy to ride in an open car. And American presidents don't do that anymore. So you young people, this is sacred ground. Dallas was a tough town back in 1963. We knew that there were angry factions that were opposed to the president. Full-page ad ran in the Dallas Morning News. So we had a battle plan. Eddie Barker, our boss, had us staged all across town to cover the various events. I covered the Kennedys as they landed at Love Field. First president I'd ever seen. They were beautiful people. Shot the film handed it off to a guy named Sandy Sanderson, who then dropped my film at the station, took me on out to the trademark where the president was supposed to speak. You got to bear in mind there were no cell phones, not everything was wired. Nothing was wireless yet those days. I was standing out in the crowd waiting to film the president as he was to leave, and a woman with a transistor radio started crying. And I said, "What? What's up?" And she said, "He's been hit." "Who's been hit?" "The president." I thought rock, bottle, never occurred to me a gunshot. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a general. I think he was general, I don't know. A guy with a lot of brass, military uniform, run into his car. And I said, "Where are you going?" "Parkland Hospital." "I'm going with you." And I jumped into his car just by instinct, hitched a ride with him, in essence, to Parkland. We were doing 90 miles an hour, and he started slamming his fist. We were in the back seat, slamming his fist against the back seat, and he said they shot him. They shot the SOB. And that's the first I knew that President Kennedy had been hit. That put me at Parkland Hospital early. There were 3 or 4 press cars in the motorcade. They obviously were there. As word flashed to the various stations, Bob and other people jumped in news units and went to the hospital. I got there before the Secret Service pulled everybody back. And it's funny what tricks your memory play on you. I had filmed yellow roses laying in the floorboard of an open limousine. And all these years I thought that was the Kennedy car. It wasn't. When I saw the show on the Discovery Channel the other night, I think I must have filmed the flowers that were in the car that LBJ was riding and Miss Johnson were riding in. But for 45 years I've had the wrong image. Secret Service began to worry that this might be a national deal, trying to take out all of American leadership. So they began to shove us back away from the emergency room, and I knew I was getting further away than my lens would cover. So I broke from the crowd and I ran into the wing of Parkland Hospital that at those days came out by the emergency room. The whole time I was running, I thought, I hope these guys don't shoot me. It was that tense. I got inside the hospital, burst into some patient's room. They were all crowded around the window, and I said, "I need that window, I'm pressed." To my amazement, they moved and let me film it. And I got there just as Mrs. Kennedy was coming out in pink dress, filmed them leaving, and then one of my colleagues happened to come by in one of the news units. He said, "Where have you been?" Because the last they knew, I was at the trademark, and they didn't know where I was just acting on instinct. And bear in mind, I was the greenest reporter in Dallas. I'd only been here 6 weeks. That over the next couple of days, they kept sending me down to the 3rd floor of the police department to film Oswald as he was being shuttled up and down the hallway. Got film of the guy holding the gun up. Got pummeled a lot. That year, I got punched out 3 times. Dallas was angry in those days. Either that or I got a bad personality and people wanted it. When Oswald was to be transferred from the city jail to the county jail, Wes drove me down there to the station early, and we set my camera up, strung a microphone up over the top, and waited. I guess a couple hours finally, and at one point they emptied the basement, checked everybody's ID. I was so new, I didn't have a press pass. Bob had to vouch for me to get me back in. They were coming down, bringing Oswald down. I was right straight line on him, and all of a sudden all hell broke loose. Loud explosion. It was a cement room, a basement, and oh, I'm sorry. Well, y'all missed some good stories. Oswald they were bringing him down this way. I didn't know it, but Ruby had walked in the ramp to my right and was standing immediately to my right. It was the old-timey camera with big Mickey Mouse ears on top, so I couldn't see him. I wouldn't recognize him. I'd never been to his strip joint. These guys had, but
Whoa. Whoa.
I was so new. I'll pay for that. This loud explosion, and I rocked back, and they timed the film after they developed it. And I was wobbly for 3 to 5 seconds, zeroed back in, and they drug Oswald back into the station. Ruby, while they were fighting with Ruby for the gun, it looked like they were coming my way with that thing. I saw a policeman dive over a car into the fight. You can't imagine what it's like to see somebody murdered, somebody wrestling for a gun, and it's coming your way. They got an ambulance in after a false start or two and wheeled Oswald out. I thought he was dead then. He was ashen, his head was wobbling on the stretcher. He wasn't. He died, they say, died at the hospital. I called the station and said, come get me, I got some great film. And they said, all the cars are gone to Parkland Hospital. Get here the best way you can. So I put all this big camera gear under my arm, stood out on the street on Main, and thumbed a ride. So that's the second time I had to hitch a ride during that deal. We wrote this book for history. I think I made $1,500 off of it, and it's cost me $5. But we wanted to share it with the world. The world changed with those gunshots. Not only government and the national psyche, but the way people got news changed. The news up until that time, newspaper, your hometown newspaper was it. If it wasn't in the paper, you didn't believe it. But events were happening too fast for the newspapers to keep up. The Four Star Telegram ran 7 special editions, and they sold out every one. From then on, people watched TV until now when they watch that little computer and cable news. Thank you for coming.
I think by inference, I'm the one who was a regular at the Carousel Club of Jack Ruby. I wasn't really a regular, but on one occasion there, which is another story, I was called upon to enter a twist contest, and I won the contest dancing the twist with Tammy True, one of Jack Ruby's strippers. That turned out to be a favor later, because the day after the assassination of President Kennedy, literally within sight out of this window right down here, this Houston Street did not go all the way through at that time. It was more or less an alley. I was sitting in the KRLD station wagon, and it was obvious that I was a reporter for KRLD, because there was the CBS eye on the side of the unit and KRLD TV and radio on it. And I saw a man walking from the rear of this building back over here through what then was sort of an alleyway toward the station wagon. And that suit of his and the fedora hat would become famous. It was Jack Ruby. So I lowered the window, and Jack said, I was up at the police station last night. That's when Bill Mercer interviewed Oswald, and he said all hell was breaking loose. And he said, this really upsets me. I'm afraid Jackie is going to have to come back to Dallas to testify in a trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I said, Jack, that'll never happen. They'll never allow that to happen, and you don't have to worry about that. And I told him about shooting the film of the Western saddles that were going to be given by the city of Dallas to John, and Caroline, the JFK children. And when I said that, tears came to his eyes, and which was happening with all of us at that time. And as a result of that, I was a witness in the Ruby trial, both for the prosecution and for the defense. The prosecution wanted to cast some question as to what he was doing here at the site of the assassination, the day after the assassination, and the defense wanted the testimony that tears came to his eyes and that he was emotionally struck by what had happened. Then there was the next morning, of course, that Jack Ruby went into the basement of the city hall and then the police station also, and shot Lee Harvey Oswald, who later died. It's amazing to me that with quite a few happenings that were accounted in the book are within sight of these windows. That's one with Jack Ruby meeting right down here, opposite that window right there. Then down here is the entrance to what was then the county jail. There are two large doors right here across, just across the street, which is where Oswald was to have been delivered from the city jail to the county prison. And I was stationed out in the middle of the street waiting for his arrival. While I was there, Sheriff Bill Decker, who was a friend of all of ours, as it was pointed out, we had a much warmer relationship with the law enforcement people and the media then than there is now. There's quite an adversarial relationship, which I think is damaging to you getting the straight story. But anyway, I was waiting out there, and I said to the sheriff, I said, Sheriff, have you inspected to be sure that manhole area right there, which by the way still exists in the sidewalk there at the county jail entrance? And I said, have you seen to it that place is secured? And he said, every inch of this place has been carefully secured. Well, in a few minutes, I thought I was going to get my big opportunity to be on national TV when Oswald would arrive, but instead, Sheriff Decker came out and announced to the people who were gathered behind the rope line back here across the street that Oswald had been shot and was on the way to Parkland Hospital. When he made that announcement, to my surprise, the crowd who was gathered here across the street and back over here on this side literally cheered, and that story is related in our book. Right around the corner was where Jack Ruby's trial took place. And in that same building, but around the corner was the courthouse of Joe Brown, who was the judge for that trial. And on one occasion, there was actually a jailbreak out of the county jail with a person who had taken a bar of soap and put some black shoe polish on it to make it look like a gun. And on one occasion, I had the camera in my hand, and I was passing the Jack Ruby trial courtroom, and this lady was being held hostage by the escapee. And the gun, there's a famous photograph of this. There's a gun aimed at her body, and she said, Wes, get out of the way. He's got a gun. And I thought sure that he was headed for the Ruby trial and that he would try to go in there and shoot Jack Ruby. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's all we'd need. Of course, the Ruby trial took place quite a few months later. But all of these things seem to happen right here in this confined area that is literally within sight of this window, and of course this window, especially the site of the assassination. I'd like to add something to what these fellows have said about news coverage on cable TV, and particularly because that's 24 hours a day, and I find myself depending on it a lot myself. I think there's some good coverage and there's some not so good coverage. That was also true back in our day, I think. I think we probably had a little tougher circumstances because we didn't have the advantage of the immediate satellite transmission of what was happening. We had to get the film back to the station, had to have the film developed, which took about 20 to 30 minutes. Then we had to edit the film. Then we had to write the commentary on the film, and in many cases, deliver the commentary on the film. Today, it's completely immediate. But I particularly find it very unprofessional the way the news, weather, and sports groups today tell inside family stories and have a habit of telling inside jokes and giggling, which I find to be very unprofessional. We would never have been allowed to do that, and as one of the guys pointed out here, as far as ever taking a side, either a liberal side or a conservative side, or even taking a definite middle-of-the-road side. We just did not do that. We simply delivered the news as we saw it. That was true of the Ruby confrontation. That was true of in my personal case, down here, of what was to have been the arrival of Lee Harvey Oswald and other events of the assassination. One more thing, and I'd like to refer modestly, but I have to admit with some pride, that I was elected mayor of the city of Dallas. 10 years, on the 10-year anniversary, it seems to be that the anniversaries, either every 10 years or every 5 years, seem to be the big times, but this one is a 5th-year anniversary, as you know, 45. But on the 10-year anniversary, I was with a U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Chicago. And since I was mayor of the city at that time, I was being interviewed repeatedly about how Dallas had changed, and I thought for the better, and I still think for the better, over that 10-year period. After one of the meetings during the day, a group of mayors were gathered around having cocktails after the day's work, and one of the mayors, and I remember he was from Toledo, Ohio, looked at me and among the other group and said, how does it feel to be mayor of the city that killed the president? My first impulse was to act physically, but I knew if I did that, it would be a national news story which would further diminish the reputation of the city of Dallas, so I refrained from it. When this gentleman, this mayor, left, the rest of the group said, that was really a low blow. That could have happened in my town just like it happened in yours. And they kind of said, well, we'll talk to him about that. The next morning, the fellow came to me and apologized profusely and said, I think it was the liquor that was talking, and I want to apologize. That was totally uncalled for. And I said, well, I accept your apology, and that was the end of it. But that was the kind of thing that Dallas was suffering, even as many as 10 years later. That's about it, and I think we're about ready for the Q&A session, aren't we, Bob? Are you going to be the man?
Yes. If you have questions, just be walking quietly up and making a line in front of this mic right here. And we'll be glad to answer your questions as best we can and as briefly as possible. If you wouldn't mind, would you please also state your name? Go right ahead, please.
Thank you. Is this working?
A little closer.
Thank you. Yeah? Okay. My name's Patty Koning, and I'm from California. And I had a question, having experienced this firsthand, what you think of all the conspiracy theories about Kennedy's assassination.
I think probably all four of us ought to get a chance at this one. But I'll begin by saying that I don't believe any of the conspiracy theories. And this is a decision that I have made after 45 years. And it took a year of study to write this book, even though we had been there. I wanted to go through, my job with Texas Monthly was making sure that virtually every word in every story that we published was correct. So the it took 1 year to read all of the right testimony from all of the right witnesses, compare all of the evidence, and confirm what I had believed all along. And that was, Oswald did exactly what he was accused of doing. He shot the president from a window on the floor below 3 times, missed with the first shot, and hit, sadly, with the second, 2. There were at least 12 witnesses who saw Oswald at the shooting of Officer Tippit. And out of those 12, at least 3 got a very close look at Oswald doing this. So there's a lot more steady information about this that's really been out there all along. The ballistics, when you fire a weapon, if you know its muzzle velocity and if you know trigonometry, you can figure out where it came from. And they did very quickly, and that's where it came from. Now, you want to add anything, anybody?
Oh, I think if there was a conspiracy and he was hired or he was an ideological member of that conspiracy, we'll probably never find out. But whoever, if that was true, then somebody really screwed up when he tried to leave and escape, because he had no help whatsoever. We think, and I think, that he was just kind of an ideological nut who tried to shoot a right-wing general earlier and then shot the president. Is there something he has association with somebody? Maybe, but they still haven't figured out the Lincoln assassination totally.
There's one interesting footnote. At the 30th anniversary, SMU School of Journalism and CNN put on a day-long seminar for just local reporters. There were 300 of us who were there. They surveyed the participants, and it was unanimous. Everybody thought Oswald was the lone gunman.
I agree with all of these. I do think this, as good journalists, I think we need to keep an open mind to the possibility that someone may come up here one day and say, well, here's a discovery that we think somebody was in cahoots with Lee Harvey Oswald regarding this. But I agree with them that overall we have had no indication of that. And I think it was the Peter Jennings treatment, wasn't it, that was so excellent. If you ever have a chance to see that one, which network is that?
It was ABC, but it's for sale as a DVD. The name of the program is Beyond Conspiracy.
Yeah, I think it's the best one that would pretty well give credence to the fact that it was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone.
Yes, sir.
To the mayor of Dallas, Bill Wesley Frazier, his 12 hours interrogation by the police has never been released. And I asked Frazier about that in a History America tours with Dave Perry, Tink Thompson, Gary Mack, Hugh Ainsworth, Bill Wesley Frazier, they were all there. And Bill got very upset, and he says, well, I was told by the head of the book depository, I can't remember, West, he says if they ever release that interrogation, I'll own this town. And I said, any chance I can get a look at it? And he got very upset, and he said no. Also, Lee Harvey Oswald's 12 hours of interrogation has never been released. Instead, the police, they talk about 3 or 4 pages of notes from Hosty and also Jim Lavelle. I think Oswald was questioned about Mexico City, his threat to kill President Kennedy down there, which was confirmed by FBI Director Kevin Kelly in the 70s. But this refusal to release 12 hours of Oswald's interrogation, to deny that they even have records of them, like the Dallas police, the FBI, the CIA, the postal authorities, is preposterous. And it points to something the government's still hiding. What are your comments on that?
Well, there were no, they didn't take significant notes, nor did they tape any of this interrogation. So there is no tape to release.
but not a tape, but wouldn't there be a mass, I mean, Oswald's 12-hour interrogation, wouldn't there be massive reports on it by the FBI, the CIA, the Dallas police that are still being hidden to this day?
No, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Robert Wilson of Boyce, Louisiana. Regarding news coverage, what do you think of the possibility of another future event having the same kind of impact the Kennedy assassination did, and what do you think the results of that revolution might be?
It would, of course, depend on the nature of it, but I would only say there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and there are many times that history turns in unexpected directions for unexpected reasons. The things that happened here in Dallas happened primarily on account of two people, both of whom were mentally disturbed, at least to a certain extent, and Ruby was on two kinds of speed. These were nutty people, and where nutty people come together, terrible things can happen. We all dread anything like that, having been in this one. And if something like that happened in today's world, perhaps it wouldn't be as shattering at the beginning as it was in our time. Perhaps because at least there are greater facilities for getting the information out quicker than we were able to. But thank you for that question.
I'd like to, this isn't a direct answer to that question, but I'd like to point something out that I think is of great importance. Security has changed dramatically over this period of 45 years, largely as a result of the assassination and probably 9/11. But back in those days, if you wanted to go to see a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, you simply went into the Dallas Morning News, punched the elevator button, walked upstairs on the third floor, walked over to Blackie Sherrod's desk and said, "How's it going, Blackie?" Today, you've got to have the appointment ahead of time, you've got to have the badge, you've got to sign in, you've got to have the confirmation. So security has changed dramatically over that period of time. It's hard for people today to visualize that kind of complete insecurity that we had at that time. As I say, probably changed with both the assassination and the drama of 9/11.
George Wallace, Reagan, they tried to hit Ford. There are people out there that would do this. And as much security as you have, somebody said it doesn't make any difference. I think Kennedy said it doesn't make any difference how much security you have. If they want to kill you, they'll kill you. And we have to fight against that. And words do count. The words we've already seen in the paper about people who've already commented on this new administration. So you have to be constantly vigilant about people like Oswald. We're out there right now.
We have time for one more question, please, sir. And if the rest of you all will be careful to answer your questions back there at the signing table, whether you're buying a book or not. We'll be glad to to answer your questions. Yes, sir.
Hi. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Sure.
My name is Glenn Bybee. I'm a math and science teacher from Los Angeles. Let's see. Mr. Phoenix, you were commenting about the happenings inside Parkland Memorial when they brought the president in. Were you there for, we've heard so much about the Secret Service and the chaos and, I guess the medical examiner trying to, hold him back, and a big fight supposedly ensued at the hospital. Were you there for any of that, or were you witnessing any of that, or?
No, I was not ever inside Parkland. I got there too late. They had already sealed that part off, and I was outside. Sorry.
But actually, that did take place when they were attempting to take the coffin with the president's body out of the hospital, and there was a conflict between the local medical examiner who needed, because this was a Texas murder case, not a federal crime in those days. Our medical examiner here, Earl Rose, tried to retain the body for autopsy and that sort of thing, of course. And there was actually a little tugging match with the coffin itself, so much so that the crucifix lying on its top almost fell off. But there was not just mass chaos in that trauma room area. There was just that.
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.